think I'd like to welcome as today. These are the last few minutes of. I'm Peter Gurovich, and I am president for the last few minutes of the Emeriti Association, and it's my honor to welcome you to our last group session of the year. And I will just like to make a few remarks to start our meeting of what's been going on for the past year. We've had an interesting year. I'd say that the big event that we do as an association, I think, continues to be our the mentoring we do for our students. We raise money and provide a group of students um, with funds every year, and we mentor them by and I think that's a very important element of the activity that we undertake, and I think it's a very meaningful part of our program for students as well as us. And we've had some interesting developments in that score. We met several months ago with the chancellor in order to make our annual report on this, and also to get his help in raising money to keep this going. And he was very excited by our program. I think he was, not that it was, he's very well aware of it, but he was very struck. He said, well, you do something very special on our campus, is that your mentorship program is very distinctive and unique. And he more or less invited us to suggest to him how this could be extended to the other scholarship fellowship programs that we have on our campus. So we've been engaged in conversation with him. We've written a report for him and ways in which this could be developed and extended. We don't think there's enough emeriti professors around to extend this to all the programs that we have, but we've written a report and given it to him quite recently about how other ways in which mentorship, the idea of mentorships, be extended by using other people to be the mentors. And so we've recently submitted this report to him, and we're awaiting the possibility of further conversation with him and other people on that. I think that would be quite interesting. So I think the founders of this organization and of that program should be right proud of having developed something which I think is unique in the system, in the UC system, and special on our campus, and is inspiring people to see it as a model. So we'll keep you informed about all of that. So I think that's an important development. Other things that were going on this year, we were also the virtual hosts of the annual meeting of Kuchia and Kukra, which I will not try to spell out for you in detail, but these are the system-wide meetings of each campus has a Emeriti Association and a Retired People Association, and these collectively group together in system-wide association, and they have an annual meeting which rotates from campus to campus. And this year was our turn, or this spring was our turn, and we decided that it would be better to do this as a virtual meeting, and it saves work and money on everybody. So we did that, and the president is Joel Dimsdale, whose photo I see right there, and the secretary is Phyllis Mursky. And so they worked with us. So we had a virtual meeting of that, which went quite well, which was also quite recent, just last month in April. And that went quite well. Another activity that's quite interesting is the Emeritus Book Club. That is how I actually became involved in the Emeritus Association several years ago. I retired a good 10 years ago, but it was only several years ago that I decided, well, the book club looks like an interesting idea. So I started to join the book club, and enjoy the diversity of people. I actually knew very few of the members of the Emeritus Book Club Association. And so but I enjoyed it. I thought that the range of books that people brought were quite interesting, and I enjoyed that experience. And I think it's because of my involvement in that I'm with you today. If you talk a lot in one situation, they then invite you to talk a lot. Now, they think if you could talk there while you're capable of talking here, as you can tell, because I think I've probably used up the time that was allotted to me And so I can see heads nodding that are in agreement with that. So I am going to terminate my introduction to you to say that's just a small sample of the many activities that go on in our association. It's been a very great pleasure to be the president of this association this year and try to make a small contribution to the many activities that go on in it. As you know, no organization runs by itself. It runs by all the other members of the executive committee and by the remarkable staff of Vanya and Jen and the other people, and Suzanne, who still has helped us a lot this year. So it's my job now to welcome you all here virtually, if not literally, and to turn the floor over to my next step. And I'm very pleased to now introduce Barbara Parker to you. I think the next step is Alan. Is that right?
Correct. Yes.
The next step is to introduce the past president, my predecessor, who was Alan McCutcheon, who is going to introduce going to present a variety of awards, and it is he who is going to present the slate of who the next president and the slate of officers who will constitute the executive committee of our Emeritus Association and the people who are going to take over. So the next person to address you is Alan McCutcheon, last year's president, chairman of this year's awards committee and nominating committee. Alan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Peter. We're going to start with the presentation of the Dixon Awards. These awards were endowed by a gift from Edward Dixon, who served on the UC Board of Regents from 1913 to 1946. At 33 years, this is the longest service of any UC regent. These awards are presented annually to honor UC faculty at each of the 10 UC campuses who have made extraordinary contributions in retirement. Since 2008, UCSD has honored between 1 and 3 retired faculty per year. This year, we have 3 outstanding winners of the award and its $10,000 honorarium. I thank Vanya Balan and 2 of the other EA Awards committee members, Phyllis Mirsky and Harry Powell, for their assistance in reviewing these nominees. 2 of them are out of the country for long-planned travel, but both of them have supplied us with a brief video of their remarks. But I'm going to start with Sonia Nkola Israel, who's with us online. She is a PhD who joined UCSD in 1979 and retired in 2010 as professor of psychiatry emerita. She is internationally recognized as an investigator of sleep who has been enormously productive in research, teaching, and mentoring, and service to UCSD since her retirement. In the 2023 rankings of the foremost female scientists in the world by a group called research.com, she was first at UCSD, 11th in the US, and 180th in the world. So, Sonia, would you like to tell us a bit more about your stellar career?
Thank you so much. Thank you, Alan. And thank you to the Emeriti Association Awards Committee for this great honor. And thank you to my dear friends and colleagues, Jill Dimsdale, Barbara Parker, who are both here, and Atul Malhotra for nominating me. As you heard, I retired about 14 years ago after close to 45 years in the Department of Psychiatry here at UCSD. I worked my whole life, and it was hard to imagine how I would fill my time. I had always traveled a lot. After all, that's one of the perks of being an academic. So I continued to explore the world, but I knew I needed more than that in my life. So it was a no-brainer that I would continue to do research, collaborating with colleagues who luckily encouraged me and encouraged my participation on their grants, dealing primarily with issues related to sleep apnea and to fatigue, sleep, and circadian rhythms in cancer. It was a no-brainer to continue publishing finishing the last of the papers from my own lab and collaborating with other papers. 176 papers of my 546 total publications were after my retirement. So that kept me a little busy. And as you heard, I was quite honored to be named in the top few of people with women with citations around the world. Since my retirement, I've also been awarded the American Academy of Sleep Medicine William C. Dement Achievement Award, the Sleep Research Society Distinguished Scientist Award, and the Society of Behavioral Sleep Medicine's Distinguished Career Achievement Award, some of the highest awards in my field. It was a no-brainer to continue to give talks. I have so much to share about sleep medicine, and I've always been passionate about sharing that knowledge. And luckily, I continue to be invited to speak in places such as South Korea, China, Turkey, Singapore, Ireland, Thailand, Italy, Brazil, and all over the United States, just to name a few. It was a no-brainer that I would continue to help the university in whatever way I could, and luckily I was invited to sit on some committees, I won't mention which, and I've always been involved in the greater San Diego community, and now I have even more time to do that, so I joined the executive board of the Jewish Federation of San Diego, as well as other organizations, another no-brainer. So I want to thank my family who put up with my life as an academic and as a busy retiree with no complaints and full support, always believing in me. My husband, Andy Israel, of blessed memory. My children and their spouses. I promised myself I would cry. David and Taylor Israel, Sarah and Jeremy Gibble, and my 4 grandchildren, who are the joys of my life. Ari, Maya, Orly, and Beckett, and my sister, Annie Gilbar, many of whom are on the Zoom. The fact that you recognize my continued work makes me realize that I am making a difference. I treasure that kind of recognition. Thank you for giving me this honor.
Congratulations, and thank you for such a wonderful contribution you've made over the course of your career. Our next awardee is David Jordan, PhD, who came to UCSD in 1969 as part of the founding faculty of the Department of Anthropology. He taught upper division and graduate courses in anthropology and served 2 5-year terms as the provost of Warren College before retiring in 2004. However, he continued to teach a heavy load, if you will, of classes as Professor Emeritus, until his full retirement in 2019. David has prepared a video summary of his wide-ranging accomplishments and experiences at UCSD, and I believe Vanya is now going to project that for us.
I'm David Jordan, Professor Emeritus in the Department of Anthropology. I'm gratified and humbled to accept the 2024 Dixon Emeriti Professorship, but I'm also embarrassed that I'm not with you to accept it in person. As you can see from the hokey background photo to this video, I'm on a long-planned trip to Greece. Cultural anthropology is a wonderful academic discipline that involves a wide variety of engaging activities. It allowed me to spend 2 years in a small village in southern Taiwan in the 1960s, where I learned about gods and ghosts and spirit possession and the impact of martial law on daily life. On sabbatical in the 1980s, I lived for a year in a Taiwanese Buddhist monastery, dining daily with the monks and nuns, but doing research on people whom they regarded as cultist heretics. In the 1990s, I interviewed marriage brokers and their clients in northern China, and then traveled through central China, visiting shrines to the god of war. Make of that what you will. Anthropological fieldwork is always an adventure. So is anthropological teaching. For over 50 years, I have taught undergraduate courses not just on China, but ranging from cultural and linguistic anthropology to social structure and archaeology, and graduate seminars ranging from fieldwork methods to the ethnography of Christianity. When Eleanor Roosevelt College opened in 1988, I was one of the teachers of the distinctive world civilization sequence called Making of the Modern World, MMW for short, where I taught units ranging from the biomechanics of bipedalism to the kingdoms of pre-modern Uganda, from the world of earliest Buddhism to the values expressed in the Iliad and the Ramayana. The huge diversity of teaching opportunities, both in anthropology and in interdisciplinary courses, is a challenge. But like many of life's challenges, it's also a privilege. I love presenting students with provocative examples and encouraging them to discover broad patterns. For that matter, I love presenting them with broad patterns and encouraging them to develop provocative examples. Even an entry-level class, a freshman, is full of students bringing intelligence and wit and background experience, ready to blossom into sophistication given the opportunity. The teaching challenge is to present that opportunity. From the early days of the internet, I have worked to supplement classroom experience by creating online teaching materials that students can find more appealing, more interesting, more carefully stated, and more memorable than textbooks. Over time, this has grown until today at over 700 or so megabytes. It's probably the largest such site on campus. My ideal has always been to stimulate out-of-class discussions with roommates. After all, nothing promotes education like explaining to your roommate in detail why he is clearly wrong. When I retired from Warren College, from the Warren College provostship in 2004, I intended to return to my department, but it turned out to be financially more advantageous to retire outright. So I did. But I continued teaching a normal load until 2019, the year which marked an even 50 years of affiliation with UCSD. My teaching today is limited to a couple of freshman seminars per year, sometimes new, sometimes reruns. But I continue to expand and modify the online materials. And I've been particularly concerned to try to separate them a little bit more completely from my own teaching to make them more available to people at other places. It's a delight when people at other universities write to tell me that they are assigning my web pages for their classes, or when students say mine is their favorite class, or when they tell me that their suite mates in other classes whiled away an entire evening simply browsing through the pages of my site, or when alumni years later cite something they learned from me that made a difference to them. Receiving the Dixon honor validates an obsession, I guess, which is probably bad for my character, but it confirms that fellow toilers in the fields of the academy do see value in the efforts I have been making. And I thank you very much for this confirmation.
Well, as you can see, David has quite a remarkable career, and I wish he were here, but I will convey our appreciation for him making that video. Finally, Marty Stein, MD, Professor of Clinical Pediatrics Emeritus at UCSD, has been a clinician and educator in the Department of Pediatrics since 1975 and retired in 2006. Since then, though, he has provided care to children with diverse clinical conditions, that is, served as a clinical pediatrician, while continuing and initiating a variety of educational programs. His textbook for pediatricians on the normal spectrum of child development and behavior from infancy to adolescence is entitled Encounters with Children, Pediatric Behavior and Development. It is in its fourth edition, with a fifth edition to be released in 2005. His many contributions to pediatric education and care will be detailed a bit more in his video. Vanya?
Hi, I'm very sorry that I can't be with you today. I'm enjoying a wonderful time with my wife in Europe, and unfortunately, we couldn't get back in time. It is a real honor to be the recipient of the 2024 Dixon Emeriti Association Award. UCSD has been my home since 1975, when I joined the pediatric faculty as a clinician educator. There weren't many of us back in those days who used that title, clinician educator, but that is what Dr. Bill Nyan hired me for, and I imagined at the time I might spend 3, 4, 5 years doing it, and here I am in 2024, although retired, still actively participating in educational and mentoring programs at UCSD and Rady Children's Hospital. I think my strength in teaching and contributing to the educational efforts at UCSD are especially focused on individual relationships with students and residents and fellows. Examples include the mentoring program that was initiated about 8 years ago at Children's Hospital, where I make rounds with the students and house staff and observe the presentations of third-year students as they present new patients. And I'm there not to comment during rounds, but to mentor the students on the quality of their presentation, with particular emphasis to not only the organization and content and diagnostic thinking, but also the way they presented to the staff, the nursing staff and the other residents and the attending staff, as well as to parents, because at Children's Hospital we have family-centered rounds. And there's almost always at least one family member there, and that provides really an opportunity for our students to present a child's problem in a way that can engage the parent as well. So I've been doing this for the last 8 years now, and it's been very rewarding. And the other project that has been equally rewarding is Professor Rounds, where for the past 15 years, on a monthly or bi-monthly basis, an unknown case is presented by the chief resident, and I moderate a panel of selected and mature primary care pediatricians to discuss the case. And the goal is not necessarily to get the right answer, although we like it when we do, and we do get the right answer most of the time. The purpose is really to demonstrate the process of diagnostic thinking, the process of pattern recognition and diagnostic synthesis to residents and medical students. And I'm pleased to say that it is one of the most effective educational programs that we have in pediatrics, at least from the standpoint of surveys by residents and medical students. In addition, I have been involved in developing a 5th edition of our textbook, Encounters with Children, Pediatric Behavior and Development, which is really the only text that emphasizes the normal spectrum of child development and child-adolescent behaviors. And it is widely used in pediatric education nationally and even in some other countries. And we'll be producing a 5th edition by the end of this year. There are other projects that I've been involved with during my retirement, and most of them have been initiated since my retirement. And I want to thank UCSD in all of its ways, from the pediatrics department to those deans involved in education, for the opportunities that I've had to continue to contribute to the educational mission at UCSD. And I want to thank you again for this opportunity to receive the Dixon Emeriti Association Award. I wish I could be there with you, perhaps in the future. Bye-bye.
So I am very impressed and thankful for these remarkable contributions that we've heard about. As you know, in 2022, CUCHIA, the Council of UC Emeriti Associations, published a survey of over 1,700 UC retirees. It found that they taught more than 780 UC undergraduate and 902 UC graduate courses during that 3-year period that was surveyed, and over 600 courses at other non-UC campuses. Our awardees are exemplars of how such ongoing efforts by retiring constitute an invaluable 11th campus to the UC system. I'd now like to move to just showing you the new members of the Emeriti Association Executive Committee. You've heard that our president is Barbara Parker. We have a new vice president who will move through the 3 offices, vice president, president, and past president, a new secretary treasurer, David Guss, and we have 5 members at large shown there on the lower left, and a number of ex officio members who then also meet with us and provide valuable input and reports on some of our activities. I'd like to point out that we have a new chair of our mentoring program, a very important component, as Peter indicated, Wayne Kennedy, a longtime administrator here at the university, and he's replacing a wonderful service for the last 2 years by Mae Brown. We have new appointees in several other areas, and so just these office appointments and so on are available on the UC site if you wish to review them. I think that's all I have to say.
Thank you very much, Alan, for those introductions. I, as the new president, was asked to give some brief comments, which I will keep very brief. And first of all, I would like to thank Peter Gorovich for his mentorship of me during this past year, Vanya and Jen for their leadership of the Retirement Resource Center and the Chancellor Scholars Program, and for always keeping the board organized. I was motivated to join the Emeriti Association Board and accept the VP role because I enjoyed meeting new Emeriti, and I enjoyed advocating for Emeriti, and I enjoyed the discussions at book club. My goals this next year are to secure permanent space for the Retirement Resource Center, to continue mentorship discussions with the Chancellor, and to evaluate opportunities for expanding engagement and participation in the Emeriti Association. I also have learned of many best practices at the other Emeriti Association system-wide programs and wish to evaluate those for possible consideration at UCSD. You've heard from Alan the incredible importance of Emeriti to the UCSD campus, and we will continue to focus on that in our discussions with the Chancellor going forward. I'd now like to introduce our Chancellor Scholars students who will be giving us a short presentation of a project that they have diligently pursued on workforce and artificial intelligence. Andrew Doan, Elizabeth Hernandez, and Phuong Nguyen. The floor is yours.
Is everyone able to see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Hernandez.
I'm Andrew Dong.
And I'm Phuong Nguyen, and today we'll be talking about artificial intelligence in the workforce. Okay, so a brief overview of what we're going to cover today. We're going to cover a brief introduction of what AI is, and then we are going to talk about how AI is seen in school and AI is seen in the workforce. And then we're going to talk about a predominant issue that we see with AI, which is the biases in AI, and then we will conclude with our final thoughts.
So let's first talk about what AI actually is for those who aren't familiar with it. Essentially, it's taking human intelligence and automating it, either putting it in machines or having a machine think for us. It's also a rapidly growing field in tech, meaning that there's a lot of money put into this, as we can see with all those cars going around, those Teslas. But since AI is so good, there's also a bunch of concerns that come with AI, mainly with job displacement, because as we can see in this picture, it looks very realistic. But when I tell you that it was generated by AI, a lot of people are, oh, they're concerned about, oh, their job might be replaced. Let's talk about concerns with AI in school though. So since the release of ChatGPT in 2022, students have become increasingly reliant on using AI to generate their work. This can be in English assignments or in math assignments, but the main issue here is that their critical thinking is hindered due to seeing how a robot can just create their assignments. One way teachers combat this is to use an AI detection tool, but there's a flaw in using those, as we can see in this graph. We take a human written response, put it into a few AI detectors, and some of them will bring up a false positive that a human written response was flagged with AI. So if I was writing an essay and then I was told that, oh, my essay had AI in it, it would be extremely disappointing, as I put all my work into that writing that essay just to get a zero. This is why teachers are now moving on. They can't rely on those AI detection tools and have to start implementing AI in their curriculum.
All right, so last November, there was a survey conducted of 1,000 undergraduate and graduate students, in which 53% of them reported that they were required to use AI for an assignment. And so what this tells us is that AI is really beginning to seep in to a lot of parts of our lives. And instead of running away from it, many people are beginning to implement it, including schools, as Andrew just mentioned. And so they're also beginning to see this potential of AI and the benefits that we can gain as a society if we show the next generations of the workforce how to properly use AI and use it in their future careers. So while we're on the topic of the workforce, let's talk about how AI has impacted and how it continues to impact the workforce. The first of which is structural unemployment due to automation. And this is a relatively straightforward concept since we've already seen it happen in our day-to-day lives. So for example, stores and cafes, they're beginning to hire less employees to work as cashiers since they've now invested in things like self-checkout systems and kiosks. And on the chart to the right over here, this is a chart that depicts jobs at risk of automation. And at highest risk, we can see waiters and shelf filers, which can easily be replaced with AI and automation in general. And at the lowest risk, we have higher education teachers and medical practitioners, which makes sense, right? And in addition to this, there are also a lot of concerns in terms of AI resume screening. So today, a lot of companies are beginning to implement AI into the hiring process. And this is concerning because AI relies on data from the past, which more often than not is impacted by some sort of bias. And so let's take a look at an example. This is a company I'm sure we've all heard of, right? So this is Amazon. And in 2014, Amazon launched a secret project where they implemented AI into a hiring algorithm. But what they found was that this algorithm had a preference for masculine language, such as words like executed and captured, which is more commonly found in the resumes of men as opposed to women. And it also found that the algorithm overlooked resumes with the word women's in it. So this can come in many forms. One example would be women's soccer team and so on and so forth. So with this considered, we also might this also gives rise to other concerns that we should keep in mind as AI begins to become more prevalent in the hiring process. So resumes can include information like zip codes, languages that we speak, and the heritage of our names. And this can subject us to racial bias as well, amongst many others, of course.
To elaborate a bit further on the racial biases, which is predominantly seen in the use of AI, especially through programs such as facial recognition. Facial recognition is mostly used to identify people, and it is used almost everywhere. It's used in grocery stores, it's used at camera, like at stoplights. And the major problem with using face recognition is that it misidentifies people at a rather alarming rate. There was an experiment done where Amazon's Recognition, which is the name of their facial recognition service and is available for public use, was tested on the members of Congress. And it was found that 28 members of Congress were falsely misidentified with mugshot photos in the criminal database. And this experiment showed that 40% of the people that were misidentified with the mugshot images were people of color, even though people of color only compose 20% of the members of Congress. And a large, the biggest factor behind this disproportionate rate of misidentifying people of color is the fact that AI algorithms use unrepresented data. And a few more examples that we would like to show you is on the left and the right, an AI program was used to generate photos. On the left, the prompt was to show an Indian person, and the only photos that it produced was an older man wearing a turban and having a white beard. Similarly, on the right-hand side, when asked to produce images of a Mexican person, the only images that the program produced were of an older gentleman again, but this time wearing a sombrero and a poncho. And then in the middle, another AI program was used, and the prompt was to create a Barbie from the country of South Sudan. And in doing so, it produced pictures of a South Sudanese Barbie holding a gun, which perpetuates the harmful stereotype that South Sudanese people are violent, presumably stemming from the recent civil war struggles and liberation of South Sudan.
So we've been talking about how bad AI has been in like the social aspect, but in reality, for most people, AI is an extremely useful tool. It can help us with productivity. It's way more precise than a human, and it can be reliable for 24/7. But there are those people that are concerned about displacement, and for those people, they have to worry about using AI responsibly. So our take is to use AI responsibly, and what that means is that when you use AI, like ChatGPT, know why ChatGPT says what it says. So if you ask it a prompt, it tells you how to do something. Know why it told you that. That way you can understand without hindering your critical thinking and without fearing that AI will take over. Thank you very much to Jen and Vanya for letting us present today. And thank you for everyone listening into today.
Thank you very much, Andrew, Elizabeth, and Fuang for a very stimulating presentation on an incredibly timely topic. I'd now like to move on to an introduction of our featured speaker today, Dr. Samuel Bossi, Professor Samuel Bossi. Professor Bossi is a professor of economics in the School of Global Policy and Strategy and the Department of Economics at UC San Diego. He is also co-editor at the Journal of Development Economics. His recent work explores the nation-building process in diverse societies, migration and cultural change, and the political economy of religion. He has a particular interest in how individuals and states adapt to the challenges of diversity, with complementary work in the United States and Indonesia. Sam is a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research, a fellow at the Bureau of Research and Economic Analysis of Development, and he is the recipient of a National Science Foundation Career Award in 2020. Professor Bossi, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Barbara, for that very kind introduction. Let me share my screen now and make sure everyone can see. Is it coming through okay?
Yes, thank you.
Great. So I have about 40 minutes, and what I'm going to try and do in those 40 minutes is give you all a sense of some of the work that I've been doing and trying to understand some of the deeper roots of culture and institutions in the United States. As Barbara mentioned, I do a lot of work on the US as well as Indonesia. And I'm starting to see more and more parallels between the nation building processes and those two very different but very diverse societies. What I'm going to be focusing on today is the United States. And I'm going to be talking about a couple of what I view as really kind of key and distinctive features of national identity and culture in the United States. And so just to highlight a few of those up front, the first kind of thing that really strikes out when stands out when you look at data on culture from surveys around the world is that the US is really an outlier in terms of how individualistic people are across this country. The second really distinctive feature, I think, at least when you look at rich countries in the world today, is the really strong role that religion plays in our political culture and politics more generally. And there's lots of other features of culture that are certainly defining the nation here in the US, but these are two that I'm going to focus on today and really try and show you some of what I've learned in my work, which has uncovered kind of new insights into how migration has really shaped these two important features of nation building in the U.S. And when we think about nation building and migration, we often think about immigration into the United States and the role that the age of mass migration historically played in shaping this country and continues to kind of shape and reshape culture in this country. What I'm going to do is focus instead on two episodes of mass migration within the United States. Some of these will involve recent immigrants or the children of immigrants, but it's really trying to understand the role of movements within the US in shaping the geography of culture and politics. And so the first is one that is going to be familiar to anyone who has studied American history, and this is really trying to understand the legacy of frontier settlement. And what I'll show you is how that process of migration really gave rise to this very deeply rooted culture of rugged individualism. And then the second thing I'll do is tell you about perhaps a little bit lesser known episode of mass migration in U.S. history. Many of us know about the Great Migration of African Americans from the U.S. South to the rest of the United States throughout the 1900s. Much less known is that during that same period, starting a bit earlier, was a very large outflow of Southern whites. And what I'm going to do is show the role that those Southern white migrants and the diaspora that they built, what role they played in shaping the foundations and kind of the evolution of right-wing conservatism in both politics and culture in the United States. And there I'll really focus on the role of religion, but there's going to be a much bigger bundle of conservative values and norms that are part of that larger project that I'll touch on. Okay, so let's begin with thinking about the frontier. So when we think about America's westward expansion, we've certainly seen maps here and there. What my co-authors and I did was went back and digitized a set of maps from the Population Census Bureau, beginning in 1790, the first year when the Census Bureau conducted a full count census. And what we can see in these maps is darker colors here. These are U.S. county borders in the modern era, but where we've interpolated the historical population data to fill in those population numbers. Darker colors here show greater population density. And then what you can see off to the west is land held by and occupied by indigenous populations in the Americas. So of course, the history of westward expansion that I'm about to show you in this sequence of maps is very much also a history of dispossession of the native peoples, as is well known in our history. Okay, but what you can also see in this red line is what we are defining based on the Census Bureau's definition that I'll tell you about later as the frontier of settlement, which is really this kind of contour line beyond which population density falls below 2 people per square mile. Okay, and so what you can see is as we move forward, decade by decade, we can see the country growing in its population and moving westward, right? It happened at different speeds at different times. The shape of the frontier is kind of evolving differently in different parts of the country, but you can see over the course of about 100 years, that process of westward expansion giving rise to the dense populations that we have come to characterize not only the West Coast, but also much of the American heartland by the late 1800s. Okay, now why does this all matter for thinking about culture and politics today? Well, we're not the first to draw some of these connections. Frederick Jackson Turner, a famous historian, perhaps could be called a political scientist. Many of you may be familiar with his frontier thesis. He made some very provocative arguments in a speech that he gave to the American Historical Association in the late 1800s. And I'll just show you a couple of those that really kind of got us thinking about some of the kind of deeper roots of this culture of rugged individualism. Okay, and so here's he says the existence of an area of free land, which of course should have quotes on it, given the native populations living there. Its continuous recession and the advance of American settlement westward explain American development. The frontier is productive of individualism. It produces antipathy to control. The tax gatherer is viewed as a representative of oppression. The advance of the frontier meant a steady movement away from the influence of Europe. As moving westward, the frontier became more and more American. And so we read Turner very seriously and some of his contemporaries and his students and tried to kind of rethink how to translate some of these somewhat fuzzy ideas into some models that we have from evolutionary cultural anthropology, in thinking about the evolution of culture, and also from the fields of political economy, trying to understand where our preferences for redistribution come from. And so that's really the kind of underpinnings of our work. And if you look at his influence, he's been called that essay has been called the single most influential piece of writing in the history of American history. He had lots of students that carried on very faithfully his message for subsequent decades. But at the same time, his history itself was, of course, woefully lacking in many respects. He left out discussion of women, of non-white populations, of the role of the federal government in certain places on the frontier. And by the late 1980s, there was a group of historians known as the New Western Historians that really tried to basically put the kibosh on the use of the term frontier, and tried to bury the Turnerian approach to thinking about America's westward expansion. And yet his ideas really do live on. So Jeremy Cronin notes that the remarkable persistence of the Turner thesis in the face of so much criticism could be attributed to many causes, and he elaborates a lot, but perhaps it expresses some of the deepest myths and longings that many Americans still feel about their national experience. Okay, and so if you look at politics today, you can see some of what Cronin was alluding to. So here's a great book on the right, Cowboy Presidents, that touches on kind of how presidents use a lot of this frontier history and ethos in animating a lot of their political ideology. Here's a snippet from Donald Trump's 2020 Republican National Convention acceptance speech, where he talks about, really echoing a lot of the kind of bombastic claims about frontier settlement that one saw in Turner's original writing, talking about the country being a nation of pilgrims, pioneers, and describing kind of the dangers that settlers faced and how they really bootstrapped themselves up. Talks about the role of religion, and really, this story of upward mobility at the core of the founding of this country by settlers from Europe. Another person who often echoes a lot of these ideas in his work is noted columnist for the New York Times, David Brooks, who during the Trump administration was writing a lot of editorials, and you could see him talking about the frontier and trying to make sense of what it all meant for our politics and our political culture. So he says the hardship of the frontier calls forth energy, youthfulness, and these have always been the nation's defining traits, and the frontier demands a certain sort of individual, a venturesome, hardworking, disciplined individual going off in search of personal transformation. He goes on to ask in a separate piece, why do working class conservatives seem to vote so often against their economic interests? He says, my stab at an answer would begin in the 18th and 19th centuries. Many Trump supporters live in places that were once on the edge of the frontier. Life on that frontier was fragile, perilous, lonely, and remorseless, and discipline and self-reliance, individualism were essential. And he'd say that many of them believe that big government support would be a long-term poison to the values that are at the core of prosperity. And so that was Brooks arguing as a journalist. Many economists and political scientists have touched on similar ideas. There's a famous piece trying to understand why the US doesn't have a European-style welfare system. And they argue that American anti-statism can be linked to the frontier and its strengthened individualistic feelings and beliefs in equality of opportunities rather than equality of outcomes. And so what we do in this original project, which is now much bigger, part of a much bigger agenda, I'm just giving you a brief window into, we go about kind of characterizing historically what frontier locations look like. And so this meant documenting the limited presence of government, characterizing the prevalence of individualism using a new measure that I'll tell you about in a little bit. And then what we did was we tried to make sense of how long has each place in America been on the frontier historically? How much scope historically was there for these frontier cultural values to become ingrained and entrenched in each location in the country? And then what we do is trace out the relationship between that history of frontier experience and show that, you know, in those places you find more individualism and more opposition to big government today. There's some other work trying to kind of dig into the deeper roots of that rugged individualism and understand where it came from. I'm not going to tell you about that today, but we have some strong evidence at a very micro, even familial level as to, you know, how culture changed over time as individuals were exposed to the frontier. So a bit more on the details. The census started tracking the frontier in 1874. Here's Turner building off of a landmark report by the Census Bureau describing what they meant by the frontier, that margin of density below 2 people per square mile. Both Turner and the census declared in 1890 that the frontier was closed by virtue of changes in the nature of settlement and technology that allowed for places to be connected much more quickly, and kind of the nature of life on the frontier to just be very different in the early 1900s. And the way to think about the frontier is not so much a physical area as a form of society. And so what we're doing is really measuring the evolution of that society. Here are some details, technical details on how we do that, but ultimately what we're left with is a measure for each county in the United States that we see colored here in red of how many years was that county on the frontier. Attracting these individuals in search of opportunity, you know, lots of kind of perilous challenges of life on that frontier. But what you can see is really a new source of cultural variation that cuts across north-south, cuts across east-west, varies a lot within state, cuts across urban-rural, and you know, the average county has about almost 20 years of frontier experience during that 1790 to 1890 period. You'll see a lot of white areas over here in the mountain region because, you know, the frontier did move, of course, after 1890, but you know, the nature of frontier life changed quite dramatically, and you know, the low density places in the early 1900s and even today are very much connected and not remote in the ways that they were in the 1800s. On the East Coast, which we also don't have here, we don't have the ability to know how long each place was on the frontier historically because we don't have population census data before 1790. We're working with some other data now to try and kind of fill that in, but for the analysis I'm going to tell you about today, it's really focused on these heartland areas in here as well as the West Coast. Okay. So let me just quickly visualize the frontier, and then I'll tell you a bit about kind of what we find empirically. So here's the famous painting by John Gast, American Progress, really showing a lot of the kind of gist of the frontier settlement process as viewed by writers and popular observers in the late 1800s. Here's Columbia bringing the telegraph and other technology. Here's a school book bringing that westward. You can see it's, of course, brighter over here, New York off in the distance, darker over here. You've got the settlers, you've got the indigenous populations, you've got the settlers leading the railroads, which is indeed something you see in the data. The railroad really came to places after people, after the frontier had already moved past it. But that just gives you a sense of the kind of way that it was viewed in popular culture in the late 1800s. Here are some actual images. striking off in those covered wagons. Frontier life could be pretty lonely. Life was a bit rugged out there. Sometimes quite lonely, as this image, a little bit precarious, as this image shows here. Sometimes very, very lonely, as this image shows here. Wives wanted. It was a male-dominated place in many frontier areas, but over time, opportunities were there for growing family farms and really expanding kind of the scope of economic activity for people who didn't have those opportunities in the eastern parts of the country, right? And so what we do is we kind of describe empirically what that process looked like, and we come up with a new way to measure individualism. And this is really coming from ideas from social psychology, where the first act of cultural transmission is the choice of what to name your children. And we know that names have lots of kind of identity content, and some people even think they might shape values and behavior. And what we do is we come up with a measure of the prevalence of infrequent names. The idea being, if I give my child a very common name, it reflects a desire to kind of fit in and conform, and be part of a broader collective, whereas giving them a less common name is more indicative of a desire to stand out. Okay, so to give you a sense of the top 10 names for boys and girls in 1850, here's a list here, not very surprising. For infrequent names, there's of course a lot of them. For those who know the famous prize-winning trilogy by Conrad Richter, Awakening Land, he follows the Luckett family as they moved from Pennsylvania to the Ohio frontier in the mid 1790s. This is fiction, but if you notice the names he chose for his characters, they're very infrequent names, and they don't show up as these very common ones. So just to give you a sense of what we're doing empirically then, and trying to understand the legacy of frontier culture and for politics and identity today. I'm not going to show you any kind of statistical work. What instead I'm going to do is give you two counties in Illinois that illustrate a lot of what we find in the broader set of counties in the U.S. So here we have Cass County in the middle of Illinois, Johnson County down here, both of them not far from St. Louis, Missouri, where I grew up. They look very similar today, about 36 people per square mile, vast majority white populations. But if you look historically, they had a very different history of frontier settlement. Johnson County was on the frontier for about 32 years, Cass County for about 10 years. And then if you look today at the prevalence of individualistic names, at property tax rates, at voting for the Republican Party from 2000 to 2016, Johnson County looks much more individualistic, much more opposed to big government, to the extent that we think that property taxes and voting for the Republicans are at least partly reflecting some of those anti-statist views. They reflect many other things, but they are capturing that. And so these are the kind of patterns that we see systematically across the country, and it's really kind of cutting across a lot of the very well-known cultural divides that have come to animate our politics and social and kind of cultural debates that have we've witnessed over the last 30 to 40 years. Okay, so just to summarize what we show, we find more individualistic names, more self-reliant attitudes, more opposition to welfare, taxation, redistribution. We don't find, and this is in survey data, and it's driven almost entirely by white Americans. If we look at Black Americans, we don't see that same sort of attitudinal relationship with frontier history in these places. And there are many reasons for that, but one of them is that many of the opportunities on the frontier historically, in terms of opportunities for upward mobility, those were not available to many African Americans at different points in the history of this country. And so it's natural to think that the kind of cultural impacts of frontier life may not have had that same that same kind of through path for African Americans. There other interesting fact about voting is that the legacy of frontier culture, it seems to be growing over time. Okay, and so you can see that in this graph here, where each dot is basically showing you the relationship between frontier experience and voting for the Republican Party. And you can see in the last 5 or 6 elections, if we added 2020, it would be up here above the 2016 line, but the impact is just growing over time. And so why is that? Well, think about the set of policies that have really come to animate the partisan divide in this country. It's things like social insurance. It's things like the minimum wage, gun control, regulating industry. A lot of these things can be traced back to the kind of deeper roots of frontier culture, or at least the perception of what life was like for one's ancestors on the frontier. Fast forward to 2020, our paper was published in early 2020, and then very immediately the pandemic happened, and we just got lots and lots of emails asking, hey, might there be a relationship between frontier culture and the response to the COVID-19 pandemic, which we know very dramatically across the country. And so if you look at Turner, he saw a dark side of frontier culture. He said the dominant individualism, it could work for good, upward mobility and encouraging kind of entrepreneurial activity, but it could also work for evil, where the tendency can be antisocial. And so I've just pulled out a bunch of headlines from 2020, and you can see all of these headlines basically questioning whether American individualism was really driving a lot of the poor pandemic response that we saw in different parts of the country, and perhaps even the country as a whole. So we see that in data that it's my right as an American to not wear a mask. Almost half of the country thought that. There's a lot of variation in masking that we saw in the data. There's a lot of variation in social distancing. And what we do is basically relate our measure of frontier experience to these measures of the pandemic response. And so we saw very strong evidence that greater frontier experience in your community was associated with less social distancing, less mask use. We saw that in counties with greater frontier experience historically, they were less likely to implement stay-at-home orders, to implement mask mandates, a range of other non-pharmaceutical interventions or NPIs. And a lot of other things that we think were drivers of that collective inaction and during the pandemic, things like civic duty, things like partisanship, kind of driving opposition to collective action to fight the pandemic, distrust in experts in science. We can show a lot of that is connected to this legacy of frontier settlement. And then the question is, was it also related to vaccine avoidance? And that's something that we didn't explore ourselves, but others have since looked at and shown a pretty strong relationship. So I think I have about 10 or 11 minutes left. What I'm going to do now is change gears. So we talked about frontier culture. I have lots more to tell you about that, but given our limited time, I want to leave a little bit of time to tell you about the other great migration. Okay, so many of you are familiar with the mass migration of African Americans out of the US South in the 1900s. You can see that here, where on the y-axis we've got the number of Southern-born Blacks living outside of the South, decade by decade, as we see it in the population census. You can see it really ratchets up beginning in about the 1920s and 30s, and then in the post-World War II era. What you may not have also known is that an even larger number of white individuals left the American South roughly over the same period but starting a bit earlier than the great migration of African Americans. To give you a sense of the magnitudes, by 1940, 11% of Southern-born whites were living outside the South. 16% of Southern-born Blacks were living outside the South. That evolved, continued to grow over the 20th century. But what we do in this project is focus on that kind of critical juncture in 1940 and try to understand the legacy of that Southern white migration. Okay. Now, there are a lot of popular writers and political scientists as well. So journalists and political scientists, I've listed a few of them here. Some names, will be fairly well known, that have talked about how in the last 30, 40, 50 years, a lot of American politics have been Southernized. The different authors have meant different things by this. Political scientists have spent a lot of time trying to understand what the new right coalition looks like that has been backing and kind of fueling the Republican Party, and really trying to understand this amalgam of three strands of conservatism: racial, religious, and economic. And what we do in this project is show that Southern white migration was really fundamental to the emergence and growth of this new coalition. And we're able to show how that migration, that mass migration of whites out of the American South, really reshaped culture and politics at a local level, but also gave rise to new possibilities for nationally, electorally viable coalitions of conservatives. And in the process, hastened the process of partisan realignment that really shifted conservative Southern whites from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party. And that really happened everywhere in the country, in part shaped by the Southern white diaspora. Okay. So empirically, what we're able to do is show what this shift from Democratic to Republican voting looked like beginning in the 1960s, and isolate the role of Southern white migrants that they played in that process, and really hone in on this critical election that happened in 1968, where the former governor of Alabama, George Wallace, ran on an independent ticket, and really kind of showed to the Republicans and Nixon after him the possibilities for this new coalition of conservatives, of racial, religious, and economic conservatives. And we can trace out a shift in congressional representation towards more conservative, at a local level, at the level of congressional districts, towards more conservative representatives in these districts with larger inflows of Southern white migrants in the early 1900s. Okay, and so the project has a number of interesting kind of elements. What I'm going to focus on today is just the kind of religious element. Okay, there's a lot to say about the so-called Great White or other Great Migration, as various historians have called it. There's lots of different things that were happening in the rest of the country, in both the upper Midwest and the Western United States, that were attracting migrants from the South. Economic changes, frontier opportunities in the late 1800s. There was a lot of upheaval in the South after the Civil War, with the end of cotton, with the Dust Bowl. A lot of these things drove people out. And you can see kind of patterns of sorting where migrants from cotton growing regions of the South sort into cotton growing regions in California and Arizona, timber regions in the South to timber regions in the Pacific Northwest, oil regions in the South to oil regions in Colorado and California. There's a lot of rich history that, if we had more time, we could certainly dig into. Here's a map showing the prevalence of Southern white migrants in 1900. Darker colors here, a higher share of the local population, traces its origins to the American South, which we're defining as the former Confederate States plus Oklahoma. Here's what it looked like in 1940. You can see an even stronger westward push. But maybe this is not surprising to those of us who have spent a lot of time in California and particularly interior parts of California. These are places with a large kind of Southern migrant history. And I guess that's true even in places like Orange County and elsewhere, even closer to the coasts. Now, this is Southern whites, and this is the geography of Southern Black migration. Black migrants, for a variety of reasons from the South, concentrated in urban areas, whereas Southern whites, they really went everywhere, right? And there's very nice work showing how Black migrants to the urban North in particular really changed the politics changed urban politics in profound ways. But Southern whites were settling everywhere, from very rural areas to small towns, all the way up to big cities. Okay. And their prevalence and kind of dispersal across the country really created scope for new sorts of coalitions of conservatives, to the extent that those conservative values were being expressed at the ballot box. Okay, and so there's a lot of kind of history of why it is that Southern whites were really drawn to the West. Here are some quotes kind of highlighting that. I don't need to belabor these, but a lot of it was kind of fleeing the demise of the Confederacy and the push for equality viewed as being imposed by the federal state in Washington. Here's a kind of famous Californian. For those who've been to Knott's Berry Farm, the Knott family actually traces its roots to a slave-owning family from the South, and one with a lot of grievances. So this is the patriarch of the family talking about the carpetbaggers came down south and disenfranchised every Southerner that had been in the war, and they settled in east of Los Angeles that had become a sanctuary for Southern expatriates, right? The Knott family, of course, became very prominent funders of the Republican Party in California and nationally, and played a big role in kind of the financial backing of the new conservative movement that emerged in the 70s and 1980s. There are other examples. Here's Boswell, owner of the largest farm in the world and owner of much farmland in California, storied history of kind of transforming agriculture in the Western United States, but also a related history of racial inequity around some of those farming practices. Can also trace his family roots to a slave-owning family in Georgia historically. Okay, so there's lots and lots of examples. I am running a bit low on time, so I'm going to move quickly through some of these other points. This graph is just showing you from some survey data in the 1960s what attitudes look like for white Southerners in the South, who tend to be the most conservative on racial issues, on religious, in terms of their religiosity. The least conservative are white non-Southerners living outside the South. And then somewhere in between are the whites who left the South. They're less conservative than the people who stayed in the South, but they're much more conservative than the whites in the places they're settling outside the South. Okay, so they're bringing some of those conservative religious and racial values and attitudes to many of these communities that they're settling in across the Western United States and elsewhere in the upper Midwest in particular. Okay, they're also transforming politics, right? They're shifting voters in their counties towards the Republican Party, especially around the 1960s as this partisan realignment is starting to happen. And that's really happening in part because they showed out in a big way for George Wallace, who ran on a very conservative independent party ticket in 1968 and really blazed the path for this realignment and reconfiguration of the American right behind the Republican Party that brought together religious, racial, and economic conservatives, right? And so here's the pretty striking image that that Trump obviously appropriated from Wallace, a Wallace campaign in 1972. But this was really a turning point in American politics, and the Southern white diaspora played a big role in kind of shifting and being that harbinger of change for a lot of that realignment that was taking place. Okay, so the last thing I want to just mention is that Southern whites played a big role in building new evangelical churches outside of the South, the Southern Baptist Church in particular, but also other evangelical churches. You can trace the leaders of these churches to to various places within the South. You can also trace a lot of the kind of emergence of conservative right-wing radio across the U.S. To a new this new base of demand coming from the Southern white diaspora population. Okay, and so we have some nice examples. The only other thing I'll mention, because I want to be mindful of time, is that even at a very micro level, we can see when Southern whites move in next to non-Southern whites in their community, you see individual non-Southern white families starting to behave in a more religious, overtly religious way by giving their children names that are evocative of important figures in the Bible and indicative of a kind of shift towards conservative religion. So just to wrap up, this work is part of a part of a much bigger project. It's really the first systematic characterization of this other great migration, and highlights a kind of really hidden in plain sight the role played by this large movement of Southern whites in reshaping and reshaping culture and politics in the United States. Thank you, and sorry for going a minute over.
Sam, that was phenomenal. Thank you very much. As a transplanted Southerner, I find this history fascinating. Thank you. Thank you very much. Peter has his hand up. For those of you who have questions, please put them in the chat or raise your hand electronically, and I will be happy to recognize you.
Thanks, Barbara. Sam, that was a great talk. I really loved it. I really enjoyed enormously what you were saying. And I think you have a lot of very valuable things to say about it. So unfortunately, you got a political scientist here. So I wanted to ask you a couple of questions. I think you just, for argument's sake, but also I'm very curious. So I think I have 2 points. One of them has to do with the role of government. I would be a little suspicious about the idea that these conservatives are not interested in the role of government. I would urge you to break that apart. They love the government when it does things that are for them, and they don't want the government when it does things for people that they don't like. They're all in favor of government price supports, dams, roads, all the things that help them. And that's been true for way back in the 19th century, even. I remember the guy who wrote the book on the guy who wrote the book on What's the Matter with Kansas. He never talks about the Cross of Gold and the complaint and William Jennings Bryan and the complaint about the populists about that they were unhappy about economic policy. He doesn't even mention that. Well, so I think that's a very big theme. What is the role of the conservatives? Like the government, they're all for the government invading the bedroom, invading the schools, the library, all that kind of thing. They don't like the government for other things. So I would break that apart. I think that requires some thought, some further disaggregation in the research that you're doing on that. And the second point I wanted to ask you about, you were touching on a little bit at the end. It has to do when you mentioned radio and these kinds of things. There's a kind of an intermediate variable in there. You're asking excellent stuff, framing a state of mind that might happen with the frontier, right? And then you leap to what are the consequences of this in behavior, like the way they vote. But what about an intermediate variable, which is the people who go in there and try to frame the way people think about the way these things are connected? I mean, that's what radio does and all the media stuff. There's a lot of ways of interpreting the material. There are all kinds of books that and literature that you're aware of that spends a lot of time examining how people are made to frame and understand their experiences in a particular way. I feel uncomfortable about leaping from a frontier mentality shaped 150 years ago or in other periods, and then leaping to a political or other behavioral consequence from that without thinking about the various ways that you can interpret that experience and the people who are making a living and devising their careers out of encouraging you how to frame that and understand that. I fear that you're vulnerable, that the way that you presented it, I haven't read all the stuff that you've written about it, but the way you're presenting it is vulnerable to leaping from an aspect to a behavioral consequence, seeing a correlation without examining the mechanism that is making those two things linked. With that, I'll shut up. But it's
Sam, would you like to
great
comment?
Sam.
And we have another question. Yes.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Peter. These are fantastic comments, as usual. I very much appreciate them. You're absolutely right on the role of government. And in fact, one view of what you're saying is big government for me, but not for thee. And I think that's certainly a big part of it. And of course, a lot of that has to do with the racial divide in this country. And a lot of the preferences for redistribution are bound up with those racial attitudes and opposition to providing social welfare to the outgroup. And so part of what some of what we're doing in newer work is trying to understand that exact element that you're hinting at, and also try and understand what it is about the kind of frontier experience. Yes, they were individualists, but they also had to cooperate to get things done. To raise a barn, you needed people to do it. And so a lot of what happened was you built a very particularistic culture around strong local identities. And in many places, in many points in American history, those identities are based on race or ethnicity. And so, it's certainly true that the preferences for redistribution and the scope of government could very much be also about the strength of one's own group identity and views about that outgroup. So you're spot on. And then in terms of the mechanisms you're highlighting, those intermediate steps, absolutely. So this is exactly why we're digging so deeply, not only into media, but also into the role of religious leaders, of churches as mechanisms for diffusing some of these ideas. We've got a new project that we're trying to figure out if we can find the historical textbooks and curriculum, figure out how this ideology of frontier rugged individualism came to be ingrained in the history books and the teaching of history in this country. So a lot of those mechanisms are things that we're absolutely trying to really dig into and fill in the gaps that that are very front and center in the big leaps that we're making.
Thank you. Ron Campbell asked, could you discuss the impact of the county as a basic geographic and statistical unit?
Yeah, thanks. So the short answer is the county is the unit at which we can observe most things in the most comprehensive way for the longest amount of time historically. The longer answer is we are now able to dig deeper beneath counties and look at towns in some instances. We're also able to, for example, in some moments historically, look at even at the level of an individual neighbor. So what happens, for example, just to preview something from some follow-up work on the Southern white migration. If I lived in Denver, I was in the 1920s, and I didn't have any Southern heritage, but my next door neighbor was born in the Confederacy and grew up during the Civil War. I was more likely to join the Ku Klux Klan as an individual in Denver in the KKK at a very micro level, right? So there, the county isn't playing any role whatsoever. But in terms of a functional unit of governance, the county matters for some things, but not others, of course. And so from an analysis perspective, it's mostly just a useful unit of aggregation over which we have a large number of observations and can make some claims about broad geographic trends.
Other questions? If not, I have one. Dick Matson has a question. If you want to unmute, you can ask your question. If not, you can write it in the chat.
Oh, I can unmute. Thank you very much. It's truly fascinating and wonderful kind of research. One thing, that book by Docek, he talks about there's many ways it further amplifies what you said, because it's about migration from the South to Southern California.
Mm-hmm.
Ones that came here actually came from the South, but from the frontier South, like Oklahoma. Mm-hmm. And so you got an extra dose of individualism plus, all the attitudes you talk about, and all that, and they were populist and they wanted initially followers of Huey Long, but then they wanted government therefore to redistribute property, but then they got into anti-communism and they ended up working for defense industries, many of them here, and so therefore big government and military
Yes.
complex. So there was all that, but one interesting thing about that is that shaped the culture of Southern California in very important ways. But that's collapsed. Culture of Southern California is basically, is liberal now.
Yes.
California is a blue state.
Yeah.
So the migration, you could see it shaping all this, but then that doesn't last forever. It collapses. So do you have a theory about how trends build, but also how they can collapse?
Yeah, so I mean, cultures absolutely change. And I think the reason it's changed so much in California is also a story about migration. It's a story about my immigration from Mexico. That's played an enormous role in changing culture and politics in California. But it's also been a story about migration of less conservative individuals, more liberal folks from elsewhere in the United States to California, and that's happened at various points throughout the last 50 to 60 years, of course, in different ways in different places. But I really think it's those two forces, combined with many other kind of maybe structural changes in the nature of the economy of California, that have kind of moved the state away from those conservative roots. But of course, you can go east, even here in San Diego, and still see a lot of those conservative roots popping up in various ways. So it's still there, and it's just not as pervasive or powerful in a kind of coalitional collective sense as yeah, you're absolutely right. Thanks.
Well, I would like to take this opportunity to thank Sam for a very provocative discussion and presentation, and for excellent questions. And also thank all of you for attending and being a part of our virtual luncheon and award ceremony. And thanks to our students who gave a very interesting and enlightening presentation. Thanks to Vanya and Jen for all the organization. And thanks to the executive committee, and certainly I can speak for myself and others. We look forward to working together during this next year in a very productive fashion. Thank you, and have a good afternoon.
Thank you all.